John McMullen, of course, every day right here on the Sports Bash. He appears via the Boardwalk Honda hotline here on 97.3 ESPN. Johnny Mac, what's up, my man?
Doing well. Finally back away from the 2 degrees of beautiful, beautiful Bloomington, Minnesota.
Yeah. What was yesterday like there? Was it kind of like the come down, or was there still a lot of people hanging around? Because I know those Monday flights were outrageously priced. So did a lot of people stick around for one more day?
Yeah, quite a few people did for that reason. And it's always funny when you see them breaking down how quickly they leave a city. The NFL just comes in, and then they are breaking stuff down. They are out on to Indianapolis, eventually Atlanta next year for the Super Bowl. But it's amazing how quickly they tear all the stuff down. That was the media center. And when you were there, Radio Row, at the food court of the Mall of America, you would have been there Tuesday, almost like a normal Tuesday at the mall.
There's a lot to dive into, John, and obviously Doug Peterson spoke today. I don't know that were you back in time for that?
Yeah, and it was clean out day at the Eagles facility, and it's one of those, obviously, whether you win or you lose in this league, everybody goes through this particular day, but it's a heck of a lot more fun when you're the last team standing and you've won the Super Bowl. It's late. It's February, and Doug kind of addressed that and said, there's a new norm. And you have to applaud Doug Peterson. He is not stepping back from the high expectations, success kind of breed upon the organization. He's saying this is the new norm in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So that's got to get people excited.
Before we get into some more of Doug's stuff, because I thought he said a lot of interesting things. I thought he was really good today, the way he closed out. Couple of news items to kind of hit on first. Sources say the Eagles' offensive coordinator, Frank Reich, is now going to interview for the Colts position because of that bizarre situation that happened with McDaniels backing out. But the domino effect is Reich's going to interview in Indy, and DeFilippo is going to interview in Minnesota. Now, I would assume DeFilippo doesn't make a decision until Reich decides on what happens with the Reich situation, because he'll replace Reich and just stay here rather than go to Minnesota, I would assume. But give us the skinny on those two situations.
Well, you kind of hit the nail on the head. If Frank gets the Indy job, the Eagles at least have an opportunity to keep John DeFilippo if they would obviously offer the promotion. Now, there's an interesting part of that, though, and I wouldn't say it's 100%, and that's because John's a very ambitious guy. He wants to be a head coach in this league and knows he's on the cusp. If he stays here, understand, this is Doug Peterson. He's the head coach. It's his offense. He runs the offense. So he's a local guy. He loves it around here. He loves the Eagles. But if he went to Minnesota or if he went to the New York Jets, he'd be under defensive-minded head coaches, Mike Zimmer, Todd Bowles, and it would be his offense, and it would be his show on that side of the football. So I wouldn't say it's completely a slam dunk that if Frank gets the job, John's going to stay, because there is that little tweak, that part of it, for a guy who understands his ultimate goal is to be a head coach in this league. And if you're an offensive coordinator calling plays, the path becomes a little bit easier. However, as I said, he is a local guy who loves this organization, coming off a Super Bowl win and having Carson Wentz here. Ultimately, that head coaching job is probably going to come anyway. So, but he has some questions he's got to think about, and they could lead to answers that people wouldn't expect.
John, also, what happened in Indianapolis, if you want to give your thoughts on that, and whether or not, because of that, Reich makes the most sense.
I think he does make the most sense. In fact, as soon as Josh McDaniels backed out, that's the first thing I tweeted. If I'm the Colts, that's the first call I'm making, is Frank Reich, because he was there before. He started his coaching career there. Obviously, there's been a number of changes back and forth in that organization, but as far as Jim Irsay, he certainly knows him. He's a stand-up guy. He's a solid guy. And you don't have this quirkiness after what you just went through with Josh McDaniels. So that's part of it. And from McDaniels' standpoint, let's be honest, it's incredibly unprofessional. He agreed to take the job. The Colts announced it. He was hiring assistant coaches, and then he changes his mind last second. That's not what you do. And as an example of that, his agent is dropping him, Bob Lamont, who obviously is a very big name in NFL.
That's Andy's agent.
Yeah, he handles a ton of head coaches in this league, a ton of general managers, and he even urged Josh McDaniels not to do this because your reputation is going to take a major hit in this league, in this industry. He did it anyway. And as I said, that's the best adjective that you could use. It's unprofessional.
Your hypothesis as to why he made the decision he did?
Well, I think it's pretty evident that they promised him he's going to be the next head coach in New England once Bill Belichick does leave, whenever that might be. He's next in line. But, as good as that sounds on paper, bottom line is Tom Brady's 40 years old. Bill Belichick obviously wouldn't be there. That organization, you saw the dearth of talent, especially on the defensive side of the football in the Super Bowl. They're not exactly set up after Belichick and Brady leave. In fact, I would say the opposite. They're in for a significant down period. And we all know professional sports at its core is very, very cyclical. And their cycle has been high for a very abnormally long time. And there's some dark days upcoming. And guess what? Bill Belichick's not going to go through them. Tom Brady's not going to go through them. Josh McDaniels is going to go through them.
I think the same thing. Like, they must have said to him, look, don't go there. You'll be the next guy here. Now, we've heard that. Like, I remember the guy in Syracuse. He was going to get the job from Boeheim and never got the job, and he's out in Washington or something right now. So there are times, but it would seem that Lamont dropping him and this would cause other organizations to stay clear. So he might be pretty darn comfortable just being the offensive coordinator in New England for X amount of years. But the problem would be once Belichick leaves, and then, yes, maybe he gets the job there, but he's really put himself in a box.
Yeah, he has. And part of it is he likes the area and didn't want to move his family to Indianapolis and uproot them. At least that's what's kind of being spun as part of the equation. But you got to ask yourself those questions before you agree to take the job. Once you agree to take the job, that's it. I mean, you don't go back on your word in any industry, and that's essentially what he did. And it's not going to make him look well to the other 31 organizations in this league. And remember, this is a guy who spent years rebuilding his own reputation after being a disaster in Denver during his first opportunity to be a head coach. And now he's going to have to go through that whole process again because he's just destroyed his reputation again.
John McMullen, 97.3 ESPN.com on the Boardwalk Honda hotline here on the Sports Bash. Some of the things Doug said today, I mean, you mentioned that this is the new norm, but they got some big decisions this offseason. Other than the Foles thing, what do you think is at the top of Howie Roseman's list?
Well, there's a number of things. I mean, as we sit here today, and we always talk about, we had some of these discussions last year because the Eagles are up against it from a salary cap standpoint. Now, Howie's always proven to be extremely deft at manipulating things and tweaking contracts. So he ultimately tends to get done what he wants to get done. But the bottom line figure is if things roll over as they are right now, the Eagles are $4 million over the salary cap. before the new league year starts. So they have to do some things. And we all know some of the veteran players on the one-year deals. You have to talk about LeGarrette Blount, Chris Long, Patrick Robinson. As far as veterans, I wrote about Jason Peters today, coming off a very serious knee injury. He just turned 36 years old late last month, and he's got a cap number that's approaching $11 million. So Doug said, gun to his head, he'd like him to be a starting left tackle. But remember, this is a more traditional football setup for the Eagles now that in the Chip Kelly era, the one disastrous year when he had the coach doing the personnel. This is now an organization where it's Howie Roseman in the off season, and he puts together the 90-man roster, and then he gives it to Doug Peterson in season, and then it's Doug's job. So it's Howie's decision to make when it comes to players like Jason Peters and everybody else who has a contract that's expiring. Jason's got more year on his deal, but as I said, at $11 million.
John McMullen's with us. Yeah, he did mention Jason Peters today. When he was asked about him, he said, "Gun to my head, he's my tackle next year." But there's a lot of interesting guys that are going to come up. What about Patrick Robinson? What is your take on that one?
That's another difficult one because he played so well. And he was, if not the best nickelback in football, certainly amongst the top 2 or 3 playing in the slot. It wasn't expected. He signed a one-year prove-it deal for not a lot of money, and now he's set himself up to make a lot of money. And people are smart enough in this league to know that things have changed, and really a slot cornerback is a starter. Really, your third linebacker is no longer a starter. So you have to ask yourself, if you're the Eagles, do you want to sign Patrick Robinson, a guy with a long history of injuries? He's never put together back-to-back good seasons. Do you want to put a multi-year deal where he's making a significant amount of money?
Some of the other things today from the Doug Peterson presser, which he said a lot of very interesting things. I thought you really saw the side of him that shows, hey, I do, he's like, I might be a pretty laid-back guy and I might not have that fiery personality, but I do this because I want to win, whether I get the credit for it or not. I mean, it really kind of affirms what a lot of people have been talking about recently, that this guy maybe has that innate feature that we weren't sure about last year.
Yeah, I mean, not only last year, I mean, we can go back 2 years, and we constantly talk about the fact that the Eagles, no matter what they say now, didn't want this guy. They wanted Adam Gase, and then they wanted Ben McAdoo, and then they finally landed on Doug Peterson as their third choice. And that's why, you look at some of the people in Indianapolis today sort of jumping off buildings thinking the organization is a disaster now. Hey, if Josh McDaniels is going to do that to you, you're better off. And if they do get a guy like Frank Reich, they're going to be very, very happy at the end of the day. It might not look that way. And that was sort of what we went through here in Philadelphia with Doug Peterson. And now everybody, as I mentioned on the show after the Super Bowl, and it was Frank Reich who said it, and said Doug's a star in the coaching ranks. That's what he is. Nobody saw it coming. I often say, I toot my own horn and occasionally say I thought he had the chance to be a very good coach early on because I saw some leadership traits, but I never thought he'd be this. I never thought he'd be beating Bill Belichick at the highest level and out-coaching him, and that's after he out-coached Mike Zimmer and after he out-coached Dan Quinn. Guy's been phenomenal, and I don't think anybody saw that coming.
No, John. When we talked to Jason Avant earlier in our interview with him, basically I asked him, did Doug always have this in mind? When he became a head coach, this was going to be the head coach he was going to be, an aggressive, never take anything guy that just lays it all out there. And in the first year, it didn't work, but in the second year, it worked perfectly.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure it didn't work in the first year. There's a theory that, sometimes you make the right decision, it doesn't work out the correct way or in a positive fashion. It doesn't necessarily mean you made the wrong decision. I think at the core of Doug's aggressiveness as a play caller is the reality that the analytics say he's right and that you shouldn't give up possession so easily in this league. And I think now that he's had such success, and as the sample size grows larger and larger, it's only going to continue to trend in that fashion. I think you see the rest of the league copying him, and you're going to see that become more of the norm of people not just giving up and saying, okay, it's 4th and 1 at the 45, I'm going to punt the football. Since the beginning of time in this league, that was the mentality. That was by the book. That's what people were going to do. And I think that's slowly changing, and Doug is at the core of that.
John, now looking ahead to the 2018 offseason, you have all these storylines, Kirk Cousins, Nick Foles, what's going to happen with him, the draft with all these quarterbacks at the top. John, to you, what is the biggest storyline this offseason that could really impact next year's regular season?
Well, it's always the quarterbacks, but I think for the Eagles specifically, I think it is what do they ultimately do with Nick Foles. I mean, they could afford $7 million is a lot of money to pay for a backup quarterback, but because Carson Wentz is still on his rookie deal, they can afford it for one more year. But as I said Monday on the show, Nick Foles' value is never going to be higher in this league. And I think Howie Roseman's smart enough to spin that off and get significant assets back for a guy who played out of his mind in the playoffs, especially the last two games. And I think you have to do it. I think that's what the reality is. And you understand that Carson Wentz is the franchise quarterback, and unfortunately, that's the way this league goes. And ultimately, I think because you've won the Super Bowl, I think it'll be easier to recruit other players. There might be a veteran quarterback out there who's willing to come here for a low number to have a chance at winning a title. So I think that's the way you have to tackle it. But it's difficult because we're going to see tomorrow, we're going to see millions of people show up in Philadelphia tomorrow to celebrate this team and the Super Bowl MVP of this team and the guy who led this team to a Lombardi trophy after 52 years is Nick Foles. How do you move on from that? It is a very, very tricky and difficult thing to do.
Yeah, we had Yvonne on earlier and asked him about the situation with Garcia in 2006, and he said there were guys in the locker room that were mad that they let Garcia walk because they thought he was a great leader, regardless if he was going to play or not. Just they thought having him as the backup, would have been a good move. But he said, yeah, that was a tough spot because there were people that liked Jeff and there were people that liked Donovan. And his answer was he thinks they should sit with Nick, have him give them a list of 3 or 4 teams and have them try to accommodate him so that he can go play.
Yeah, I mean, and then comes to the part, does Nick even want to leave? I mean, because he's seen the other side of the fence and the fact that things went so poorly with the Rams that he contemplated retirement. And he's the kind of guy, there are very few guys, but he's the kind of guy who I think would be willing to stay as the backup to Carson Wentz and go back and be part of the supporting cast. I think he has the ego to do that. There's also the competitive aspect of it, though. Maybe he thinks he can be a top-tier starting quarterback in this league. I don't know. Maybe he thinks or understands part of the reason he was so successful is because of this offensive scheme. There's a lot of questions that have to be answered. And from Nick's perspective, he's got to answer those. But from Howie's, he's got to do what's best for the Philadelphia Eagles. And that's always difficult to do when you have a player who's so popular, who just led you to a Super Bowl championship. But the reality is, if you take the emotion out of it and just look at things logically, everybody knows who the quarterback of this team is. And so you have to maximize what you have. And ultimately, I think that's what Howie does. But it's going to be very, very difficult.
All right, Sports Bash Live, of course, the parade tomorrow. Any advice for the people that are making their way up there, John?
If you can imagine, they're expecting, I think there were 2 million at the Phillies parade. They're expecting more. If you can imagine 3-4 million people in between Broad Street and the Art Museum, hey, good luck. I don't know what to tell you. But as the mayor said, the small minority of knuckleheads, stay home. Yeah. This is just a celebration and a chance for people to have fun.
All right, John, of course, the parade tomorrow starts at 11, and we will have coverage for you here on 97.3 ESPN. Thanks, pal.
Thanks, John. Great work this year.
Hey, thank you, guys.